We are taught from a very young age that power is a divine gift, a sacred trust handed down from the heavens to maintain order in a chaotic world. For centuries, kings claimed they were anointed by the very hand of God. Popes declared themselves the infallible, absolute voice of the Creator on earth. Prophets and visionaries demanded unquestioning obedience, promising their followers the keys to paradise in return for their total surrender. We build statues to these figures. We carve their names into marble and write their deeds into textbooks, smoothing out the rough edges, washing away the blood, and presenting a sanitized version of human history. But what happens when the heavens go quiet? What happens when a mortal man, sitting upon a throne of absolute unchecked power, realizes that he is just flesh, and that his flesh is failing? What occurs in the human mind when the boundaries of morality, law, and even death are completely erased by the intoxicating drug of supremacy? Welcome back to the Shadowed Codex. Tonight, we turn our pages away from the glorious battlefields and the sunlit monuments of civilization. We are stepping into the suffocating, claustrophobic chambers of ultimate authority. We are going to witness the terrifying, tragic moments when power divorces itself entirely from sanity. We will look at what humanity becomes when the leash is completely removed. In the next 45 minutes, we will sit in the freezing shadows of a torchlit basilica in Rome, where the highest court of spiritual law dragged a rotting corpse from its grave to stand trial. We will travel across the Mediterranean to the burning, blinding sands of Jerusalem to watch a teenage king rot alive beneath his royal robes, fighting a war not just against empires, but against his own disintegrating body. And finally, we will endure the freezing, merciless winter of a German city where a charismatic false prophet turned a holy utopian dream into a nightmare of iron cages and starvation. If you find solace in these forgotten, darker corners of human nature, if you seek the truth that hides beneath the floorboards of history, please consider subscribing to the Codex. Leave a gentle like and help keep this lantern lit in the darkness. Now, find your rest. Dim your lights. Let the warmth of the fire guide you. Let the sound of the rain wash away the noise and the anxiety of the modern world. Lean closer to the embers, close your eyes, and listen to the echoes of the past. Our first chapter takes us to the heart of the Christian world, Rome. The year is 897 A.D. To understand the absolute madness of what is about to happen, you must first understand the Rome of the late 9th century. The glorious Roman Empire has long since crumbled into dust, its grand marble temples stripped and repurposed, its aqueducts broken, its streets turned into a dark, decaying labyrinth. This era is known to historians as the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Age of the Papacy. The Church is not guided by pious theologians. It is controlled by ruthless, mafia-like noble families. The Spoleto faction, the Formosans, they wage bloody, relentless gang wars in the streets. The Papacy, the holiest seat in the Western Christendom, has become nothing more than a political prize. Popes are elected through bribery, poisoned at dinner tables, and strangled in dungeons with terrifying frequency. Into this meat grinder of corruption steps Pope Stephen VI. Stephen was a man consumed by paranoia and driven by political debts. He belonged to the Spoleto faction, and his legitimacy as pope was highly questionable. But Stephen decided that simply executing his living political rivals was not enough. To secure his throne, he had to destroy the legacy of the man who came before him. His hatred extended beyond the realm of the living. It reached down into the grave. Imagine the absolute horror of the graveyard workers on that freezing January night. By the order of the Pope himself, they are sent to St. Peter's Basilica with iron pry bars and shovels. They locate the tomb of Pope Formosus. Formosus had been dead for 7 months. He had died of a stroke, his body sealed in a stone sarcophagus, meant to wait for the resurrection. Listen to the scraping of the stone lid being pushed aside. The workers tie thick hemp ropes around the stiff, decaying remains. Formosus is dragged from the damp earth. The smell of putrefaction fills the cold night air. His body is hauled through the uneven cobblestone streets of Rome in the dead of night, a grotesque parade of desecration, until it arrives at the massive wooden doors of the Basilica of St. John Lateran. Step inside the basilica. The stone walls radiate a bone-chilling winter cold. The vast vaulted ceilings disappear into the shadows, illuminated only by the frantic, dancing light of hundreds of beeswax candles placed around the altar. The air in the room is thick, unnaturally thick, almost unbreathable. It is heavy with the suffocating sweet smoke of frankincense and myrrh swinging from golden censers. But the incense is not there to honor God. It is there for a purely practical reason: to mask the unmistakable, sweet, sickening stench of rotting flesh that permeates the holy sanctuary. Sitting on the papal throne, propped up awkwardly by wooden stakes hidden beneath his clothes, is the corpse of Formosus. This is not a symbolic effigy. It is the actual decaying body. The priests have dressed the corpse in the magnificent, heavy, gold-threaded vestments of the highest office on earth. Look closely at the throne. The golden, jeweled papal mitre rests precariously upon a skull where the skin is peeling away, revealing the bone beneath. The heavy, ornate rings of the papacy have been forced onto blackened, skeletal fingers that curl inward like the claws of a dead bird. And standing before this grotesque display, pacing back and forth like a caged animal, is Pope Stephen VI. His face is twisted in a mask of absolute screaming rage. The flickering candlelight casts long demonic shadows across his face as he points a trembling finger at the silent, decaying thing on the throne. He shouts accusations of perjury, of coveting the papacy, of breaking sacred ecclesiastical laws. When you were Bishop of Porto, Stephen screams into the echoing silent hall, his voice cracking with hysteria. Why did you usurp the universal Roman See in such a spirit of ambition? The corpse, of course, says nothing. The empty eye sockets simply stare blindly into the darkness of the church. But a medieval trial, even one born of pure madness, requires a defense. And so, crouching terrified behind the heavy wooden throne, hiding behind the rotting robes of the dead pope, is an 18-year-old deacon. This boy, trembling so violently he can barely remain upright, sweating in the freezing cold, has been ordered by the Pope to act as the legal counsel for the corpse. Whenever Stephen screams a theological accusation, the boy must squeak out a defense on behalf of the skull sitting mere inches from his face. He stammers, his voice echoing weakly against the stone columns. He is forced to speak for the dead, knowing that if he speaks too well, he might share the corpse's fate. It is a scene of pure, unfiltered psychosis. The highest court of spiritual law in the world has been reduced to a macabre theater of political vengeance. The bishops, the cardinals, and the noblemen sit in the wooden pews, watching in horrified, paralyzing silence. No one objects. No one dares to stand up and point out the insanity of cross-examining a cadaver. Such is the terrifying, paralyzing grip of absolute power. When the man holding the sword tells you a corpse is on trial, you nod and observe the trial. The verdict, naturally, is predetermined. Formosus is found guilty on all charges. What follows is an act of spiritual and physical desecration that would scar the history of the Catholic Church forever. Pope Stephen orders the guards to approach the throne. He commands them to strip the corpse of its golden robes, tearing the sacred fabric away from the rotting bones and dried flesh. Then comes the final punishment. Stephen demands that the 3 fingers of the corpse's right hand, the thumb, the index, and the middle finger, the exact digits used by a pope to bestow holy blessings and consecrate the host, be hacked off. The severed fingers fall to the stone floor. The mutilated body, now officially reduced to the status of a common damned criminal, is dragged roughly out of the basilica. It is pulled by its heels through the dirt and filth of the Roman streets, past horrified onlookers peering from their windows, and finally thrown into the murky, freezing, fast-flowing waters of the Tiber River. Pope Stephen thought he had erased his enemy. He thought he had rewritten history by erasing the physical vessel of his predecessor. But madness breeds madness, and the universe has a strange sense of irony. Legend says that on the very day the corpse was thrown into the river, a violent earthquake shook Rome, partially collapsing the roof of the Lateran Basilica. The superstitious population saw this as a clear sign of God's wrath. A few days later, a monk claimed he found the waterlogged body of Formosus washed up on the banks of the Tiber, and that the corpse was miraculously performing healings. The people of Rome, disgusted, terrified, and pushed to the breaking point by the sacrilege, rose up in a violent mob. Within months of the Corpse Synod, Pope Stephen was overthrown. The mob stormed the papal palace, stripped Stephen of his own papal robes, threw him into a dark, damp dungeon, and strangled him to death. The Corpse Synod remains a terrifying permanent stain on human history. It is not just a bizarre footnote. It is a profound psychological lesson. It shows us that when a man believes he wields the absolute, unquestionable power of God, there is no boundary, not human decency, not logic, not even the sacred, quiet peace of the grave that he will not cross. Take a deep breath. Let the heavy, sickening scent of the incense fade from your mind. Let the cold stone of Rome dissolve into the rain. In Italy, we saw a man use power to punish the dead. But as we turn the heavy parchment page of the Codex, we move to a different kind of tragedy. We are traveling to a place where supreme power was trapped inside a body that was dying while it still breathed. We leave the cold marble and the political shadows of Europe and travel east to the burning, blinding sun and the baked earth of the Holy Land. The year is 1174. The Kingdom of Jerusalem is the most precarious, violent, and fiercely contested piece of real estate on the planet. It is an isolated Christian outpost surrounded by vast, hostile Islamic empires, held together only by the heavy broadswords of crusader knights, massive stone fortresses, and the sheer, unyielding willpower of its rulers. At the center of this fragile, beautiful, and bloody kingdom is a boy named Baldwin the Fourth. When Baldwin was just 9 years old, a moment occurred that would alter the destiny of the Middle East. His tutor, the esteemed historian and Archbishop William of Tyre, was sitting in the courtyard watching the young prince play a rough game with the sons of the nobility. The boys were pinching each other's arms, digging their fingernails into the skin, trying to see who could endure the pain the longest without crying out. William watched closely, and he noticed something deeply terrifying. Baldwin didn't flinch. When the other boys pinched his right arm, twisting the skin until it bruised, the prince simply smiled, entirely unfazed. William called the boy over. He took a needle and pricked the skin of the prince's right arm. Baldwin did not pull away. He felt absolutely nothing. The nerves were dead. The royal physicians were summoned. They conducted their cruel, primitive tests in the dim light of the palace medical chambers. When the diagnosis was finally whispered in the corridors of power, it was a death sentence, not just of the body, but of the soul. Leprosy. To understand the sheer horror of this diagnosis, you must understand what leprosy meant. In the Middle Ages, it was not just a bacterial infection. It was considered a literal curse from the Almighty, a physical manifestation of spiritual impurity. According to the book of Leviticus, the afflicted were unclean. Across Europe, when a commoner was diagnosed with leprosy, they were subjected to a mass of separation. The priest would read them the last rites, shovel earth over their feet, and legally declare them dead to the world. They were forced to wear a heavy woolen cloak, carry a wooden clapper or a bell to warn the healthy to run away, and were banished to leper colonies to rot in total isolation. But Baldwin was not a commoner. He was the heir to the throne of Jerusalem. You cannot banish a king. At the age of 13, following the unexpected death of his father, this boy, carrying the most stigmatized, feared, and misunderstood disease in human history, was crowned king in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. To truly grasp the tragedy of Baldwin IV, you must try to imagine the agonizing, claustrophobic prison of his daily life. Leprosy, caused by the bacteria Mycobacterium leprae, is a slow, methodical thief. It does not kill you quickly. It steals your body, nerve by nerve, piece by piece, over years of waking nightmare. First, the sensation goes. You cannot feel the warmth of the sun, the cold of the stone floor, or the touch of a human hand. Then the extremities begin to ulcerate. The skin thickens, folds, and turns dark, taking on a horrifying nodular lion-like appearance. Fingers and toes lose their bone mass, absorbing back into the body or simply rotting and falling away. The cartilage of the nose collapses, leaving a gaping hole in the center of the face. Eventually, the bacteria attacks the optic nerves, and blindness sets in. And yet, the cruelest part of this disease for Baldwin was that it left his mind completely untouched. Inside this decaying, terrifying shell, Baldwin's intellect remained razor sharp. He was a brilliant military tactician, a deeply educated ruler who spoke multiple languages, and a fiercely proud king who understood the heavy burden of his crown. Popular culture and modern cinema often depict him wearing a polished silver mask, a beautiful, haunting piece of metal hiding his disfigurement. While historians debate the exact nature of his covering, whether it was indeed a forged metal mask or thick, heavy veils of linen wrapping his head entirely, the metaphor remains perfectly true. He was a man forced to hide his rotting humanity behind the cold, unchanging, metallic facade of royalty. Imagine the psychological agony of his existence, to be the supreme commander of a warrior kingdom, expected to lead men into brutal hand-to-hand combat, yet unable to hold a sword because your fingers have withered into stumps. To sit on a throne, surrounded by ambitious lords, scheming barons, and his own power-hungry sister Sibylla, knowing that they look at you not with reverence, but with a mixture of thinly veiled disgust, impatience, and pity. They were all just waiting for the dead boy to finally stop breathing. Imagine sitting in the high council, smelling the sweet rot of your own necrotic flesh beneath your expensive silk robes, while the priests swing excessive amounts of incense around the room just to mask the scent of your dying body. And yet, the miracle of Baldwin is that he refused to hide. He refused to let the rot consume his duty. In 1177, Saladin, the legendary brilliant Sultan of Egypt and Syria, marched on the Kingdom of Jerusalem with a massive army of over 26,000 men. Saladin knew the Christian king was a crippled leper. He assumed Jerusalem was ripe for the taking. He allowed his troops to spread out and pillage the countryside, ignoring the boy king entirely. But Baldwin did not stay in his bed. Though his body was covered in weeping open sores, though he had to be physically lifted and strapped to his war horse because he no longer had the grip to hold the reins or stay in the saddle, the Leper King rode out to meet the greatest conqueror of the age. He managed to scrape together a desperate force of only 500 knights and a few thousand infantrymen. They intercepted Saladin's massive army at a place called Mont Gisard. When the Christian soldiers saw the overwhelming sea of enemy troops stretching to the horizon, terror set in. They were vastly outnumbered. They were going to be slaughtered. But then the king acted. Baldwin, his face wrapped in bandages, his hands wrapped in bloody linen, ordered his men to dismount him. He threw himself onto the unforgiving desert sand in front of the true cross, which had been brought to the battlefield by the Bishop of Bethlehem. The teenage king wept, his tears soaking into his bandages, and prayed aloud for God's mercy and strength. When he stood up, struggling against the weakness of his crumbling spine, the sight of this dying boy, sacrificing his last ounces of life for his people, electrified the Crusader army. Baldwin was strapped back onto his horse, and this boy, rotting from the inside out, who could barely hold a lance, led a devastating, blinding cavalry charge straight into the heart of Saladin's forces. The shock was absolute. The Muslim army was caught completely off guard by the ferocity of the attack. Saladin's elite bodyguard, the Mamluks, were decimated. Saladin himself barely escaped with his life, forced to flee across the desert on a racing camel, leaving his entire army to be shattered by the Leper King. It was one of the most stunning military victories of the entire Middle Ages. But victory on the battlefield could not stop the microscopic enemy multiplying in his blood. The years that followed were a slow, agonizing descent into darkness. By his early 20s, the king was completely blind. He could no longer walk. His body was so ravaged by the disease that he could not even sign his own name on state documents. He was carried in a wooden litter, issuing strategic commands from behind his thick veils, listening in the darkness to the fading footsteps of his allies as they abandoned him, realizing his end was imminent. He died in the spring of 1185 at the age of just 24. King Baldwin IV's story is a profound, heartbreaking meditation on the cruelty of fate and the sheer endurance of the human spirit. He possessed the ultimate power, the wealth of a kingdom, and the fanatical devotion of an army. Yet all the gold in Jerusalem, all the prayers of the priests, could not buy him a single healthy breath. He was a king who commanded tens of thousands of men, but remained a prisoner in the darkest, most inescapable dungeon imaginable, his own decaying skin. Breathe out. Release the burning heat of the desert sands. Let the tragedy of the Leper King rest in the archives. Our final story tonight takes us far away from the holy deserts, deep into the freezing, unforgiving cold of northern Europe. We are moving from a king who fought a heroic battle against his own madness and decay, to a common tailor who embraced madness entirely. We are traveling to a city where pure faith mutated into an apocalyptic nightmare and left behind a terrifying monument that still hangs in the sky today. Look up. If you travel to the city of Münster in western Germany today and stand in the central market square, look up at the towering Gothic stone spire of St. Lambert's Church. There, hanging high above the city, exposed to the punishing rain, the freezing snow, and the passing of 5 centuries of history, you will see something deeply unsettling. Suspended from the stone face of the clock tower are 3 large, human-sized, rusted iron cages. They are empty now. The birds nest in them. Tourists take photographs of them. But in the bitter winter of 1536, they were not empty. They held the twisted, mutilated remains of a dream that became a living hell. They held the bodies of the men who tried to build heaven on earth and created a slaughterhouse instead. The story of the cages begins in 1534 during the chaotic, violent upheaval of the Protestant Reformation. Across Europe, the old Catholic order was shattering. Peasant rebellions were violently crushed. People were desperate, starving, and convinced that the end of the world, the biblical apocalypse, was happening right then and there. Out of this desperation emerged a radical fringe sect known as the Anabaptists. They believed that only adults who fully understood their faith could be baptized. They believed in holding all property in common, and they believed that God was about to destroy the wicked and save a chosen few. Through a series of political maneuvers and violent uprisings, thousands of Anabaptists flooded into the walled city of Münster. They expelled the wealthy merchants, drove out the Catholic bishop and his priests, and locked the massive iron-studded city gates behind them. They declared that Münster was the new Jerusalem, the only city on earth that would survive the coming wrath of God. At the head of this apocalyptic cult, after the death of the initial leaders, rose a man named John of Leyden. John of Leyden was not a learned theologian. He was not a priest. He was a 25-year-old Dutch tailor and a former innkeeper. He was charismatic, theatrical, handsome, and possessed a terrifying, intuitive understanding of human vulnerability and crowd psychology. At the head of this apocalyptic cult, after the death of the initial leaders, rose a man named John of Leyden. John of Leyden was not a learned theologian. He was not a priest. He was a 25-year-old Dutch tailor and a former innkeeper. He was charismatic, theatrical, handsome, and possessed a terrifying, intuitive understanding of human vulnerability and crowd psychology. Once the city was fully sealed off from the outside world, and the expelled Prince Bishop returned with a massive mercenary army to lay siege outside the walls, John of Leyden did what all cult leaders do when trapped. He systematically, piece by piece, dismantled reality. First, he ordered that all doors in the city must be left open day and night, destroying the concept of privacy. He declared that all property belonged to God, forcing citizens to bring their gold, silver, and food to the central square to be redistributed by his loyal guards. Then he went after their minds. He ordered that all books in the entire city, philosophies, histories, ledgers, literature, be brought to the cathedral square and burned in a massive bonfire. Only the Bible was spared. John knew that to control the future, he had to erase the past, making his voice the only source of truth available to the terrified citizen. A few weeks later, John ran completely naked through the streets of Münster in a frenzied state, collapsing into a deep trance that lasted for 3 days. When he awoke, he claimed he had spoken directly to God. He declared himself the absolute king of the New Zion, the ruler of the entire earth, preparing the way for the return of Christ. He abandoned the simple, ascetic clothes of the early Anabaptists. He dressed himself in magnificent robes of crimson velvet and gold silk, taken from the plundered churches. He forged a crown depicting the world pierced by a golden sword and established a royal court of terrifying delusional opulence inside a city that was entirely surrounded by enemy cannons. But the true nightmare began when John, claiming divine revelation, instituted forced polygamy. Because many men had fled the city or died in early skirmishes, women outnumbered men nearly 3-1. John decreed that any woman of a certain age who refused to marry one of the brothers was a sinner against God. Women who resisted, who tried to cling to their original husbands or their independence, were dragged to the market square and publicly executed. John himself, leading by his twisted example, took 16 wives. One of them, a woman named Elizabeth Wanchera, eventually realized the madness of his rule and asked permission to leave the city. John led her to the market square and personally beheaded her in front of his other wives before dancing around her headless corpse. He ruled by pure, unpredictable terror. He acted as the supreme judge, jury, and executioner, holding lavish public banquets in the square where he would feast on roasted meats, pause to decapitate a dissenting citizen with his own hands, and then return to his meal. Imagine the psychological horror of being an ordinary citizen trapped inside Münster during the freezing winter of 1535. Outside the high stone walls, a brutal mercenary army is waiting to slaughter you the moment the gates fall. Inside the walls, a psychopathic tailor in a velvet crown is executing your neighbors for whispering doubts. You are trapped in an open-air asylum. And then, the food ran out. As the bishop's siege dragged into its second year, no supplies could get in. The New Jerusalem descended into the absolute abyss of starvation. The horror within the walls defies modern comprehension. The people of Münster stripped the paint from the walls of houses to boil it for sustenance. They ate the grass from the churchyards. They boiled the leather from their own shoes, their belts, the scabbards of their swords. They hunted rats until there were no rats left, then mice, then insects. And eventually, in the dark, freezing cellars, they began to look at the bodies of the dead. And yet, inside the captured palace, John of Leyden and his inner circle continued to eat. He had hoarded the city's remaining grain, wine, and salted meats for himself and his court. When people collapsed from starvation in the snowy streets outside his window, he preached from his balcony that the king needed his strength to bring about the kingdom of God, and that their suffering was a holy test of faith. Madness, total, consuming, arrogant madness. He had convinced thousands of starving people that their agony was divine, while he lived in gluttonous luxury. But illusions, no matter how powerful, cannot stop cannonballs, and starvation eventually breaks even the strongest fanaticism. In June of 1535, betrayed by a desperate, starving man who snuck out of the city and showed the bishop's troops a weak point in the defenses, the gates were breached. The mercenary army poured into Münster in the dead of night, and the massacre that followed was absolute. The streets ran thick with blood. The utopian dream was extinguished by the sword. John of Leyden, the tailor king, was captured alive, hiding in a cellar. The prince bishop who reclaimed the city did not want a quick execution. He wanted to make an example of the false prophet. He wanted a punishment so unimaginably cruel, so viscerally terrifying, that no one in the history of Europe would ever dare to claim the voice of God to usurp political power again. 6 months later, in January 1536, a massive platform was built in the central market square, the very place where John had held his horrific banquets. John of Leyden and his 2 top lieutenants were tied to heavy wooden stakes. Before a crowd of surviving traumatized citizens and visiting nobility, the executioners heated iron tongs and glowing braziers until the metal was white hot. For over an hour, the executioners systematically used the burning tongs to tear the flesh from the bodies of the 3 men, pulling the muscle from the bone while they were entirely conscious. Through it all, historical accounts state that John of Leyden did not scream. He endured the unfathomable agony in an eerie, fanatical silence, perhaps still believing that angels would descend to save him. Finally, after an hour of torture, a dagger was driven deep into his heart, ending his delusion. But for the Prince Bishop, death was not the end of the lesson. The mutilated, charred corpses of John and his 2 commanders were shoved into 3 custom-made heavy iron cages. Using pulleys, the cages were hoisted to the very top of the steeple of St. Lambert's Church. The bishop left them there, suspended in the sky, exposed to the crows, the freezing winter winds, and the scorching summer sun, to rot in full view of the city they had destroyed. A permanent warning to humanity. Centuries passed. The flesh decayed. The bones eventually turned to white dust and blew away in the German wind. The church itself was damaged in wars, hit by bombs in World War II, rebuilt and modernized, but the people of Münster never took the cages down. When the church tower was rebuilt in the 19th century, they put the original cages right back up. When the city was reconstructed after the bombings of 1945, the cages were repaired and hung once again. They still hang there tonight, in the dark, rusted, empty, and silent. They are a permanent, terrifying monument to the fragility of human civilization, a reminder of the monstrous things humans will do to one another when they are handed absolute power, when they are stripped of reason, and when they are convinced they are doing the unquestionable work of the divine. We close the Codex for tonight. We have walked a long, dark road through the bloody, incense-choked courtroom of Rome, where vengeance reached into the grave, across the tragic burning sands of Jerusalem, where a young king's spirit outlasted his decaying flesh, and into the freezing, caged hell of Münster, where a tailor built a kingdom of starvation on the blind faith of his followers. 3 stories of power, a pope who let his hatred outlive his enemy, a king who became a prisoner of his own skin, and a prophet who turned a search for salvation into an atrocity. As you lie in the dark tonight, listen to the steady rhythm of the rain. Feel the warmth of your own bed. You are safe. You are far away from the madness of medieval kings, the scheming of popes, and the violent delusions of false prophets. The iron cages are empty. The silver mask is lost to the desert, and the dead are finally at rest. But as you drift into sleep, remember, the shadow of power is never truly gone. It is always waiting in the margins of history, sleeping in the hearts of ambitious men. All it takes is the right moment of desperation, and one man convinced he alone speaks for the heavens, for the nightmare to begin again. Sleep well, if you can, until we open the Codex once more. Good night.